All right, welcome back, everybody. We are moving into my favorite part of the semester. That is that up until this point, most of what I've taught you about public speaking has been how to become good, informative speakers. You all have had an opportunity to give some kind of informative speech in your classes, and congratulations on that again. We are moving away from informative speaking to persuasive speaking, and this is my favorite part of the semester because I find that a lot of undergrads are pretty good at arguing when it comes to they want something and they're going to fight with you to make sure that they get it. What is a little bit challenging is that a lot of you are not explicitly taught how to argue, and there are actually better and worse ways of arguing. So this week and next week, we're going to spend our time on persuasion. I'm going to teach you two of my favorite theories. We'll start with my actual favorite theory today, which is called stasis theory. Stasis theory is an introduction to different types of argument because not all arguments are the same, and a lot of our arguments depend on other types of arguments. What is helpful about stasis theory is that it'll help us figure out how to classify what kind of argument we're having. And once you know what kind of argument you're having, you'll be able to have that argument better. So it's another one of those times where I'm teaching you something to help you become better speakers, but I'm also teaching you to become better listeners. I'm teaching you to become better arguers, but I'm also teaching you to become better at counter-arguing when other people are trying to persuade you. So we'll go ahead and move into stasis theory. It's my favorite theory. Before we do that, I just want to make a distinction between information and persuasion. Up until this point, a lot of the times when we've talked about informative speaking versus persuasive speaking, we've talked about them in terms of general or specific purposes for giving your speech. An informative speech is going to look very different from a persuasive speech, at least one that's overtly persuasive. A lot of public speaking textbooks will take these and say these are two wholly separate realms and never the two should meet. What we're going to do in here is actually say that they're more on a continuum than they are separate categories. And what I mean by that is there's actually, if you think about it, very little informative speaking or very little informative writing that is purely informative. If you're looking at the kinds of speeches that you might give as an informative speech, you might be teaching somebody a new skill, and you might say, okay, I'm teaching them a process for how to do this skill. But as you're doing that, you're also teaching them, you think they should know how to do this skill. So if you're teaching them how to change a tire, you're trying to give them something that they should know how to do. There are value judgments implicit about that for people who don't know how to do that thing. There's also persuasive messaging in there that's talking about how to do this thing the right way. If you really sit down and think about it, there's not a whole lot of messages that we get on an everyday basis that don't have some kind of persuasive component to them. Something as simple as singing happy birthday to someone might feel like an innocent gesture, but even in that singing of happy birthday on your birthday, there are persuasive messages there too. There are persuasive messages that I care about you. There are persuasive messages that you should care about me. Maybe I'm singing happy birthday, but I want to be the loudest one in the room because I want to date you or because I want something from you, and so I want you to pay attention to me. Very often we have informative speech that crosses over into the realm of persuasion. And I think when we really sit back and look at how persuasion operates, we can see that not a lot of people do it all that well. If you start looking for those persuasive messages, and if you know what to look for, more often than not, you're going to find times when somebody tried to persuade you. Initially, you thought it was a good idea and you went along with it, but if you really sat with it, they may not have the right answer about everything. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. That's also where we're going to spend a lot of our time next week. Now, I mentioned that stasis theory is one of my favorite theories. In order to understand it, we need to do a very, very quick grammar lesson. I apologize that this is going to be a bit of a review for you, but you'll understand what I'm getting at here with this distinction between informative and persuasive messaging. So in a purely informative sentence, the basic building block of any sentence, if you've taken an English grammar class or any classes in grammar in another language, you know that the general sentence consists of a subject and a predicate. That is, there's some person, place, or thing, and then there's a predicate, something that that thing is doing. The shortest sentence in the English language is I am. I exist. It's three letters, it's 2 words, it's the shortest sentence in the English language. This is the building block of every sentence that we have in the English language. If you have a subject without a predicate, it's not a complete sentence. I know that's review for some of you. But what I'm getting at here is that when we're talking about persuasive sentences in particular, what we're dealing with is a subject and a predicate as well. The difference is that the predicate is always controversial. The predicate can always be otherwise. So instead of the temperature is 36 degrees Fahrenheit, which is more in that informative realm, we could actually get out a thermometer and say, okay, the thermometer says 36, this thermometer also says 36, this one says 35.9, but we can round it to 36. That's one that we can agree upon. It's not all that controversial. When we're dealing with a sentence like lutefisk is disgusting, what we have instead is an argument. What we have instead is a persuasive attempt. And the reason for that is because some people, especially some people in North Dakota, happen to think that this stinky fish tastes very good. So if you say lutefisk is disgusting, but somebody else could finish that sentence with the predicate lutefisk is delicious, that means that we have controversy. And any time that we have persuasion, there has to be some kind of controversy, and persuasion is going to try and direct us in one particular realm or the other. They're going to try and say there are two or more options. Something could be otherwise, but I happen to think I'm right. And when it comes to persuasion, we usually have to support that persuasive claim with evidence and reasoning. And so the basic building block of a sentence in persuasion is a topos, that is some kind of an idea. Topos is the Greek word for place, plus a stasis, or a controversy. That stasis is anything that could be otherwise. And when we have that equation, that's when we know we're dealing with persuasion. And when we're dealing with persuasion, usually we need to back up our claims. So to start with that building block, like I said, topos is the Greek word for place. Sometimes when it's also the origin of the word topic. And sometimes when we're dealing with the word topos, or if we're dealing with a particular topos, it means that we're moving from place to place. You might remember Joshua Foer, that memory champion we talked about all those weeks ago. He said that when you're moving through your memory palaces, you're moving from different places. He was talking about Greek topoi. And topoi could be a literal place. It could be somewhere like Newtown, Connecticut. But a topos can be any subject. It can be any figurative idea. So it could be something like a school shooting that happened in Newtown, Connecticut. That's what we're dealing with on that level. When we're dealing with the Stases, what we're dealing with is different realms of controversy. And I love teaching this theory to undergrads because undergrads love to jump to the bottom two here. And you can probably guess that there are 5 and that each of those 5 serves a different purpose. So what we're going to be dealing with is different kinds of persuasive stases. And those stases are going to tell us what kind of argument that we're having. A lot of you have probably had the experience where you're arguing with a friend or a relative or a significant other, and you're talking and you start having an argument about something small, and it spirals into another argument about something a little bigger, and it spirals into something a little bigger, and then pretty soon you're talking about something else, you're fighting, that fight has intensified, it's changed topics multiple times, and you don't even remember the original thing that you're arguing about. There's an example of this, not to use all television references as I teach, but for those of you who watch How I Met Your Mother, there's an episode where Marshall and Lily are fighting about the dishes, and then they go from fighting about the dishes to fighting about a bunch of other things like Lily's scary voice when she tries to tease Marshall, or about their mother-in-law. And what happens is the argument moves and moves and moves and moves. And part of what's problematic about that is that when we're dealing with persuasion, that's a sneaky way to manipulate people. To not argue about the original thing that you were arguing about in the first place, and instead to just keep changing the terms of the argument in order to win. But to win different arguments than the one you started with. So we're going to talk about all 5 of these different stases, and we're going to talk about them as a way of understanding persuasive claims. Next week, we're going to come back and we're going to add to these persuasive claims different types of evidence and reasoning, because as you might guess, there are different standards for evidence and reasoning based on which stasis you're at. This is part of why it's my favorite theory to teach, because a lot of people don't know how to slow down that process from moving from one argument to the next one. And if you can't slow it down, usually there are a lot of problems with that, and that's where you start on a weak premise, and you keep building upon that weak premise. And for those of you who are in architecture, if you've got a shaky foundation, everything you build on top of that foundation is going to be unstable. So that's what we're going to be dealing with today. The first stasis is probably one that's a little confusing, and it's a little confusing just because of the name of it. These are ideas that came out of the Greek law courts, and they were arguing about who was guilty for particular crimes. And the first crime is what they called in ancient Greece the stasis of fact or conjecture. When we're talking about the stasis of factor conjecture, this is the first stasis, and it's dealing with things as trying to establish a shared reality. So in the Greek law courts, they were arguing about who did what. So to give you an example of this, if you were in a car accident, let's say you and I were in a car accident, we would probably end up calling the police if the accident was pretty severe, and let's say we're at the intersection where the car accident happened. The police officer is going to show up on the scene, and part of what we're going to try and figure out is who is at fault for causing this accident. We're not quite there yet. Before we get to that point, what we're instead dealing with is the story of what happened. So you and I are going to have different versions of how that accident transpired. I might say that you ran a stop sign. You might say that you saw me texting. Somebody else might say that you tried to stop, but your brakes failed. There's lots of different ways to try and figure out what did or did not happen. And that's what we're dealing with at the stasis of factor conjecture. What we're dealing with, and this is one thing that I'll credit Kellyanne Conway for, is when we have facts and we have alternative facts. And we're trying to establish a factual record of either what has happened, what is happening, or what will happen. Or we're trying to understand basic comparisons. So what we're dealing with are matters of being in existence, and ultimately what we're trying to get at is a shared reality. That police officer is going to have to file a report, and he's going to have to trust whether you ran the stop sign or whether I was texting or whether something else happened to lead to this accident. We're dealing with questions of being in existence, and what trips undergrads up about this particular stasis is the term fact. And that's why I prefer to use fact or conjecture. It's things that still could be otherwise, but if they were not otherwise, they would be matters of factual record, much like when we were measuring the temperature. So if we're dealing with questions of fact or conjecture, we're dealing with being in existence. One example of that is asking whether human beings are alone in the universe. That is a controversial statement, therefore we could have persuasion about this. So let's get some practice with this. Somebody tell me an argument for why there might not be aliens. How do you know that there are not aliens? Anybody want to try? Yeah.
No current context.
Okay, so we've tried, we actually have a program called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. We've tried to contact to see if there's alien life elsewhere in the universe. To my knowledge, nobody has responded to SETI, so we could then conclude possibly that human beings are alone in the universe. Aliens do not exist. Somebody else tell me on the other side a reason why aliens might exist, or do exist.
There are billions and billions of planets in the universe.
Okay, so if you've taken an astronomy class, you know that there are lots of not just planets, but galaxies. The Milky Way galaxy is one among many. There are lots of places where we are not able to reach even with our best scientific and NASA equipment. We can't get to certain places in the universe, and therefore there may be places so far out of our realms of seeing and being that there might be aliens that exist somewhere in the universe. Anybody else want to try and argue for or against? Yeah?
One time I saw this really big blue flash in the sky at night. For sure wasn't a shooting star, I know what they look like.
Okay. So there are lots of reports that people have of seeing unidentified flying objects or seeing alien figures. There are lots of people who will argue that aliens exist. There are lots of people who would argue that aliens don't exist. Here we're dealing with a conjectural question. It's one that we can't yet answer, but it's one that we'd like to answer for a lot of reasons. We'd want to know if we're in danger. We'd want to know that if something were to happen to Earth, that we would maybe have another planet to go to that would be safe for human life. Right? There are lots of reasons why we would want to know the answer to this question, but if you were trying to marshal evidence and somebody else was on the opposite side of this question, is it easy or difficult to do that? Is it easy to persuade someone if you're convinced 100% that aliens exist and someone else is convinced that they're not, or vice versa? Would you say it's pretty easy to do that, to persuade them to join your side? No, why not? What? Okay, so we don't necessarily have conclusive evidence about this question. We could have 5 million reports, but if all 5 million of those reports are bogus, then we're stuck. We could have conclusions that there's no alien life because we haven't yet encountered it, but as soon as we encounter one, we have to revise our conclusion. So it's not always easy to argue at the stasis of factor conjecture because we don't have the answers to questions that we normally would have the answers to through science or through observation or through religion perhaps or philosophy. We want to answer these existential questions. We can't necessarily answer them. Let's try another one. There will or will not be another attack on US soil on the scale of Pearl Harbor or 9/11 in our lifetimes. Anybody want to argue one side or the other on this one? Yeah. Okay, so we already have seen two examples of nuclear weapons, both used by the US in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If, say, another country like Iran or North Korea were able to get possession of a nuclear weapon, then there would be another attack on the scale of 9/11 or Pearl Harbor in our lifetimes. See if I can get someone else. Anybody else want to argue for or against? It's funny because in my informal evaluations, one of the comments was, don't keep calling on the same three people, and yet the same three people are the ones who raise their hands. Go ahead.
Cyber attacks.
Okay, a cyber attack. Say more about that.
They could attack our infrastructure, or break, or attack our privacy, or some sort of national security.
Okay, so there might be some kind of cyber attack. We've already seen a couple of those. They've been pretty widespread. So far, nobody's died from them, but it's possible that if they were to do a cyber attack on a power grid, or if they were to do a cyber attack on a nuclear site, that people would die from that. Would anybody argue that we know that there will not be another attack like this in our lifetime? Or if you were going to do that, how would you go about doing that? Okay, we don't necessarily know how long we're going to live. Some of us might die tomorrow, and if that's the case, we have good reason to believe that it's not going to happen that way. These events that I pulled up are also not all that common. Pearl Harbor was in 1945, 9/11 was in 2001, so we're looking at maybe 60, 70 years between these big-scale events. There are lots of ways we could argue about these. These are the kinds of arguments that you could have at the bar and, at 2 o'clock in the morning and not really get anywhere, because you can always find additional evidence. Nevertheless, factor conjecture questions are probably the most important kind of question that we have. They are the foundation that we have for a lot of the other types. Before we get to the other types, does anybody want me to clarify anything about that stasis? What does it mean? Or how do I know when I have a question like that? Crickets, okay. I'm going to presume that you know this then, but a lot of you probably will have questions later on, so I'll come back to that. Our second stasis is the stasis of definition. And instead of asking, is it, or will it, or was it, when we're talking about history or we're trying to predict the weather, definitional questions are another kind of argument that we could have that are not about whether something exists or whether something will or won't happen. Definition arguments instead are arguments about what we call something. What is this thing that I have in front of me? So I'll tell you that when I was a little kid, people loved to come up to me and ask me different questions to categorize different things. Let's say when I was in kindergarten. And I remember somebody came up to me, a relative said, what's this? Is it a fruit or a vegetable? Is this a fruit or a vegetable? And they came up with, apples and lettuce and things like that. And they pulled out a tomato. And they said, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? And at 5 years old, what do you think I said? Is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? We're really quiet. Raise your hand if you think I said it was a fruit. Raise your hand if you said I think it was a vegetable. A lot of you said I thought it was a vegetable. I did think it was a vegetable, and I was corrected that technically, at least in the United States, tomatoes are classified as fruit. Does anybody know why that is? I think I heard somebody say it. It has seeds. Anything that has seeds is technically a fruit. And so I was corrected that tomatoes are not a fruit. But I thought that they were because I said, tomato is like an onion. It's like lettuce. It goes in a salad. So my criterion for determining what a fruit is and what a vegetable is were the wrong criteria. It's not what goes in a salad. It's actually whether it has seeds. When we're talking about definitions often get really technical, and a lot of people get into semantics with definition. They say, you're just fighting with me about semantics. And as a rhetorician, I'll tell you that I happen to think those semantics are really important. So to give you another example, I'll say that one person's terrorist is often another person's freedom fighter. You've probably heard this argument where somebody is going to label someone from a particular group, whether that's the PLO in Palestine and Israel, whether that is the Basque separatists in Spain, whether that's the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. There are lots of groups who say that they, if they self-define, are freedom fighters, but they engage in acts like bombings and suicide bombings and mass stabbings and mass shootings and demonstrations and acts that other people often label as terrorist attacks. And when somebody is labeled as a terrorist, it often means that somebody is going to say that particular behavior is justified in fighting terrorism. But it's not always clear-cut who does and who does not constitute a terrorist. And so when we're dealing with matters of what we should call something, whether we call it terrorism or whether we call it fighting for independence or freedom, matters a whole lot in terms of how we respond to those people. There are lots of ways that we could fight over definitions as well. One of them is a lot of people will make arguments that something like Facebook, or I've seen pornography labeled as a drug. And I've seen people say things like fight the new drug to talk about those things. So somebody tell me an argument of why Facebook might be considered a drug. Yeah, Brian. It's designed to be addictive. A lot of people check their phones a lot. I saw statistics a few months ago that said the average person checks their phone 150 times a day. That's a lot of checking your phone. You spend a lot of time on Facebook and Twitter. So it's addictive. Addictive qualities are one of the criteria that we have for establishing whether something is or is not a drug. Somebody else, make an argument for or against why Facebook or Twitter or other social media might be constituted a drug. How would you know? Yeah.
It's not something you physically put into your body.
Okay, so most drugs are things that we physically put into our body. We drink alcohol, we smoke marijuana, we inject heroin, whatever it happens to be, you're physically putting it into your body. Facebook is external, it never goes into your body, and therefore it can't be a drug. Anybody else want to make an argument for or against? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, similar argument. A drug is usually a chemical. That chemical usually has mind-altering properties. Facebook is not a physical chemical. We can't, bottle up Facebook and put it on the table in front of you. Then again, there are people who would argue that even though Facebook itself is not a chemical, if you spend a lot of time on Facebook, it alters your brain chemistry. That's another criterion that we could use to say that Facebook is a drug. I'm not here to tell you whether one is the right or wrong answer. What I'm here to show you is really that there are arguments for both sides, and those arguments often depend on which criteria we're using. Does it have to be a chemical? Does it have to go into your body? Does it alter your brain chemistry? Is it addictive? Those are all the criteria that we use in definitional arguments that don't usually get exposed in factor conjecture arguments. There's another one here, and that's a question of whether capital punishment, also known as the death penalty by lethal injection, constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. We're not going to debate this one like we have with the other ones, but I will tell you that this was an interesting question and a very controversial one a few years ago, a very high-stakes question. So the term cruel and unusual punishment comes from the 8th Amendment to the US Constitution. It has very clear prohibitions against anything that we label cruel and unusual punishment. There were lots of anti-capital punishment groups who were arguing that lethal injection by the death penalty does constitute cruel and unusual punishment. What got interesting a few years ago is that the companies that made the drugs that were often used in drug cocktails to put people to death were made by companies outside of the United States. And guess what? A lot of those companies were not big fans of the death penalty. A lot of those companies, or a lot of those countries where those companies are, had already outlawed the death penalty. So some of those suppliers in Europe were saying, we're not going to give you the cocktail that you need in order to put people to death. If you want to continue with the death penalty by lethal injection, you're going to have to find other ways to do it. And so there were companies in the United States that were for capital punishment and said, okay, we're going to come up with our own other alternative version of the drug cocktail. And what happened is a lot of people started having bad reactions to it. So the idea of lethal injection as not being cruel and unusual punishment is usually that there's a sedative to put someone to sleep, and then they don't feel the pain, and they just die when the third injection is given to them. What happened in this case is that people were having rapid convulsions and people were having allergic, really bad, severe reactions to the drugs that were being used. And there were a lot of anti-death penalty groups that got on board and said this does constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and we shouldn't have it. We're not going to debate that one, and you could see how there would be arguments on both sides, like maybe perhaps there were pro-death penalty groups arguing that people got what they deserved if they were guilty and they had those bad reactions. Even if it is cruel and unusual punishment, maybe what they did to somebody else was worse. I'm not here to tell you what the right or wrong answer is. My favorite part of teaching you stasis theory is that I'm not here to teach you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think and what to think about. And that's what stasis theory is really good for. It's helping us figure out those controversies so that we can figure out what cognitive dissonance, if any, we might have, and maybe try to resolve that cognitive dissonance. So that's a second stasis for you, and that one builds often off of the first stasis of factor conjecture. The third one is one that usually comes most easily to undergrads, and that is, does X cause Y? The stasis of causes and consequences. Or if I do this thing, what effect will it have on me? If I smoke cigarettes, if I smoke a pack a day, will I develop lung cancer? That's a stasis that we're pretty accustomed to, especially living in a society that privileges science. A lot of scientific questions are trying to figure out causal relationships. And so with something like smoking and lung cancer, that was something that was actually really controversial in the 90s. There were a whole bunch of lawsuits against tobacco companies trying to make this argument, and a whole bunch of people defending the tobacco companies trying to say, no, smoking does not cause lung cancer. It's only fairly recently that a lot of people have started to accept this link, but for a long time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, people smoked a lot of cigarettes without having this link in place. This works pretty well for hard science things that we have more or less definitive answers to, although sometimes we fight about hard science as well. We get a little bit caught up in different kinds of arguments. So one of them, one science controversy that gets really interesting is when we start talking about social science. There are a lot of people in my field in communication who are interested in media effects literature. And media effects are trying to figure out what does it mean when we watch a whole bunch of television that tells us black and brown people are dangerous? What does it mean when we watch a whole bunch of violent video games? Does that cause violent behavior? What does it mean if our television shows are sexist or racist or homophobic? And there are a lot of people who study this stuff for a living, and the question of violent video games became really popular, especially after the Columbine shooting. And about a decade after the Columbine shooting, there were two really interesting studies that came out. And they were studies that we in the Academy call meta-studies. What that means is it's not just one study where they put a bunch of children in a room and watch their behavior. What it is actually they're reading every journal that they can find where somebody has done that. And they're looking at, across the 50 different studies that we looked at, what are the conclusions that we can draw about whether violent video games cause violent behavior in children or adolescents. Does anybody want to guess what happened when there were these two meta-studies that came out? Based on what you see on the board here, they actually drew totally opposite conclusions. One of them said, if we watch 5 decades of scientific data, there's an irrefutable conclusion that exposure to violent media increases aggression. What that means is that study was looking at 50 or more different studies, and they were saying in all of those studies, the conclusion is violent video games cause violent behavior in children. When we get at the other study on the bottom here, what it says is that current analysis does not support the conclusion that media violence leads to aggressive behavior. It cannot be concluded at this time that media violence presents a public health risk. What do you do then if you are a parent and your 14-year-old kid wants to play Doom or Grand Theft Auto or Halo? How do you know which of these meta-studies to trust? We like to think that all science points in the same direction. My master's thesis advisor was famous for saying that human behavior is infinitely variable. What that means is that some people might see violent media and might be inclined to act aggressively. Other people might watch a whole bunch of violent media and turn out just fine and have no idea or no desire to hit their friends or to engage in a school shooting. But if you're a parent of a 14-year-old kid, what do you do? Who do you trust? Yeah. Okay, so you trust the most recent one. I'll tell you that one of these studies came out in 2008. The other one came out in 2009. Is that recent enough for you? Maybe. Anybody else have a different answer?
Since human nature is variable, I think you have to watch your kid, not the study. It depends on them and how they're behaving.
Okay, so sometimes we use science to make decisions. Sometimes we also trust our instincts, right? Sometimes as parents, you have to know your own child, and maybe you observe them while they're playing the video game and say, okay, this kid is fine. Or maybe you see how they act in other contexts. Whatever it happens to be, you can't necessarily trust social science research when it gets messy. Another way of looking at this is whether one thing causes another. There are lots of advertisements that will try to sell you something based on sex, and they'll try to say, okay, sex sells, so we're going to say if you use Axe body spray and you spray a whole bunch of it on yourself, that if you're a male, you're going to attract all of the women that you want to attract. Anybody buy that argument? I see a lot of women shaking their heads and saying, no, I do not buy that argument. Why not? Because a lot of young men like to spray a whole lot of Axe body spray, and they spray too much of it. Too much of a scent is not a good thing. The place where I most encountered Axe body spray was in the boys' locker room after gym class, and it was Axe body spray mixed with teenage BO. It was not the most pleasant smell in the world, and you start associating those things together. So causal relationships get complicated, but lots of people try to make arguments based on cause, and they say if we can tell a cause of something, we can figure out what to do with it. Another argument, another stasis for you then after causality is if we know the causes of something or we know the effects of something, oftentimes we have arguments about whether that thing is good or bad. Does Axe body spray smell good or not? When we're talking about the stasis of value, what we're dealing with are questions of whether something is good or bad, and as you'll see, there's a lot of different categories of good or bad. In aesthetics, we have beautiful or ugly, we have productive or unproductive, wise or unwise, necessary or unnecessary. Like the stasis of definition, oftentimes value judgments are grounded in criteria. Who gets to decide what makes something good or bad? And so we have examples, maybe we go to see a movie together and you decide afterwards you're mad at me because you say that movie sucked in teenage lingo. That movie sucked, it was terrible. Well, how do you know that it was terrible? There are lots of different arguments for what makes a movie good. Sometimes that has to do with the plot line, sometimes that has to do with the acting, sometimes that has to do with whether it's doing anything experimental, and if it is, if it succeeds at it. We could also have arguments about whether X is a good version of Y, and this is kind of a hybrid of value and definition. So we could have arguments over whether somebody is a good Christian. We could have somebody who lives their life by what they interpret to be the Christian Bible. They read that Bible regularly, and they really just don't like going to church. And so they don't go to church. Does that mean that they're a bad Christian? We could also have someone who goes to church regularly but doesn't take any of the lessons they learn at church, or they maybe are getting bad lessons at church, and they live their life and they're kind of a jerk. Which one is the better Christian? Well, it's often in the eye of the beholder. It's often based on the criteria that you're using to make that kind of argument. So you're going to have to argue at the stasis of value, and that's one of the stases that's very fraught. If you remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about different values and I had you rank your top 3 of a choice of about 30 different values, part of what's challenging about that is because people don't like the cognitive dissonance that comes from choosing one or the other. Last but not least, we're going to go to the final stasis, and that stasis is the stasis of policy. And the stasis of policy is asking us, should we do something? What should we do? And the reason I'm sharing this with you, and the reason why I'm sharing all of stasis theory with you, is because at the end of the semester, your final project is going to be a group deliberation. And that group deliberation is going to be policy-oriented. What it means is you're going to make a new law or a new idea for somebody that's binding. And so we have a measure on our ballot right now that's asking whether the state of North Dakota should legalize marijuana. And there are a lot of people who historically have not been in favor of that, who say, well, maybe we'll get revenue from it. Maybe it'll help with farming. Maybe it'll offset the tariffs and some of the damage that we've had from that. A few years ago, also at the stasis of policy, on the individual level, I had to ask myself the question of whether I should shave my head. And there's a reason why I had to ask that question, and that is that my friend Marina was raising money for charity. She was raising money for a childhood cancer charity, and we had both lost a friend had a cousin who had childhood cancer and actually died of childhood cancer shortly before this charity shortly before Marina decided she was going to donate to this charity. And Marina really wanted to shave her head and raise money from shaving her head to donate to charity. And she couldn't do it. She couldn't bring herself to do it. And part of that is because she was scheduled to get married in the next 3 months. And she wanted to look good for her wedding. And so I said, you know what? I have an activity that I do with my undergrads in public speaking where they raise money and donate money to charity based on speeches that they give. I'm going to sabotage that activity, and I'm going to offer that if my students raise a certain amount of money, then I will shave my head in your place. And that's exactly what I did, and you can see that it was not a good look for me, but I felt pretty good about doing it. Nevertheless, I had to ask myself whether that was a good policy on an individual level. The reason why I share policy with you is because a lot of undergrads like to rush, and not just undergrads, politicians, the media, academics, a lot of people love to jump to conclusions about what should we do. They like to say that they can know in advance what the best course of action is, and that's the only argument worth having. It's not worth arguing at definition. It's not worth arguing about cause. All that really matters is whether we win or lose, and we win or lose based on the outcome of the policy debate. So I could give you a couple different examples of policy debates that we could have. One of them is that the United States should switch to the metric system. As you'll see here, the United States is one of 3 countries around the world that does not currently use the metric system, which is kind of weird. A lot of other countries use it. A lot of people in the United States are also very accustomed to it, and they don't want to have to switch over to talking about cubic milliliters and centimeters and things like that. It's a little confusing. So we could have arguments on both sides of the policy debate, but ultimately the policy in the United States, at least historically, has been that we will not use the metric system. We could also have a conversation around whether institutions of higher education, so colleges and universities, should abolish grading. And I've heard good arguments on both sides of this one as well. I'm not necessarily convinced one way or the other, but I want to hear your thoughts. What are some reasons why it might be good or bad to have grading? And if we do decide good or bad, should we just get rid of grading altogether? What do you think? You all have taken enough class here to know. It's an incentive to do better. So a lot of us like good feedback. We like to find that if we get an A, we feel good about ourselves. So it might make us work harder in order to get that A. Okay. So it might be an incentive to do things. If you have to do things to get a grade, then you're going to go do that. Would anybody argue in favor of abolishing grading at the higher ed level? I'm not talking the K through 12 system. Yeah, a lot of people really care only about the grades. I remember the first semester that I had teaching, you can probably imagine that I very rarely got a grade that was not an A in class. And I remember having students who seemed only interested in getting a C or D in the class. And I remember one of my friends saying something that they learned as an undergrad, and that is that C's earn degrees. You've had to earn A's and B's in a lot of cases in order to get into the University of North Dakota, but once you're here, if you graduate and you have a C average and you graduate and you have an A and somebody else has an A average and you're up for the same job, not every job necessarily cares that much about your GPA, and some employers would actually rather hire a B student than an A or a C student because the A student, they say, maybe doesn't know how to handle failure and the C student may not know how to work all that hard. Those are arguments that I've heard. They're not necessarily my own positions, but nevertheless, there are a lot of people who do only care about getting that minimum grade. Anybody else want to make an argument for or against? Yeah. Okay, you get out of it what you put into it. So if you all are adults, at some point you have to stop doing things for that extrinsic motivation of somebody else is going to give me a grade. If you're learning your major and your major is going to influence your career, you probably want to do well in it. You probably want to call yourself an expert in it. You probably want to have the skills that you need in order to do that job. So we could have lots of these debates over and over again, and these are all just basic claims. The evidence and the reasoning that we're supplying for them is kind of surface level today. We're going to go into more detail about that next week. Before we finish up today, I've got a couple more things for you, and the first is your participation question for today. And this is just a test to see how well you understood stasis theory. Some of you might get this participation question wrong, and that's okay. I want you to try, but if you're struggling to understand, I threw a lot of ideas at you today. If you're struggling to understand stasis theory, I want you to spend the next week or so really becoming an expert in it because it's something that will serve you very well. So the question for today, we're in week 9, I believe. Is that correct? Yes, we're in week 9. Your question for today is, at which stasis is the following claim? Keeping animals in zoos is unethical. Is it a question of factor conjecture, definition, causes and consequences, value, or policy? So you can go ahead and log into Blackboard, try to answer that question. So everybody at least have the question down. Somebody be brave and tell us which stasis you think that one's at and why. Thank you, go ahead. What's that? You say it's the stasis of value. You're correct, but I'm curious how you know it's the stasis of value. Yeah, the stasis of value is dealing with questions of whether something is good or bad in a variety of different ways. And one of those good or bad ways, especially when we're talking about ethics, is whether something is ethical or unethical, just or unjust. The question itself is not going to tell you how you should answer that question. Some people in this room might say, yes, that is unethical. Other people in this room will say, no, that's not unethical. But the point is that you keep these arguments separate as much as possible so that you're not arguing about more than one thing at a time. It helps keep you focused. So you can go ahead and answer that question. We're going to move on just a little bit. One thing that I really want you to understand about the stases is that those are what we call interdependent or interconnected. What that means is up until this point today, what I've been doing is trying to teach you that the stases are separate and that you should only have one kind of argument at a time and you need to stay focused on that. What's challenging about stasis theory is that what happens at one stasis when you stay at the same topos, when you're at the same topic, that stasis usually has implications for the other stases. Usually there are going to be problems that come up in the stasis of value or policy or perhaps even causes and consequences that are unresolved questions at the stasis of fact. We're not sure what the facts are of what we're debating. So before you all leave, I just want to walk you through an example to show you how this works and to show you how easily it moves from one to the next, and how challenging it is when we build upon a shaky foundation. So we're going to take an example, and that example is we're going to look at the issue of abortion. We're looking at this issue in part because I think a lot of people have talked this issue to death. Most of the people in the room probably already know how they feel about it, and they probably aren't going to change their minds about it. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about this issue from the perspective of the stases and understand that they are all interconnected. So we live in this bumper sticker society, and that bumper sticker society is often trying to just make a claim, and it's trying to make a claim very quickly. It's a chicken, not an egg. Abortion stops a beating heart. Texas is pro-choice. Smile, your mom chose life. Those are all trying to answer one of the stasis questions, but they're not providing any evidence and reasoning for that. This is how a lot of social media discourse takes place as well. A lot of arguments over Facebook and Twitter start and stop with these short claim statements. I want to slow down our conversation a little bit because I think what often happens when we live in this bumper sticker or tweet society is that we get very short arguments and we don't think very critically about them. So let's just take a look quickly before you all pack up, before you all head out, at how this works in practice. So one of the problems with the abortion debate is that there are a lot of people who are trying to answer at the stasis of factor conjecture, at what point does life begin? If you drive around North Dakota like I do, you probably see a lot of billboards that talk about how fetus has a heartbeat at X number of weeks, or they can smile at X number of days, or whatever it happens to be. Science is often trying to answer the question, at what point does life begin? And science is not the only thing that tries to answer that. Religion also answers that. So you might drive around and you might see billboards across North Dakota that say things like, life begins at conception. That is a religious perspective, but for a lot of religions that are not Christianity, the perspective is not necessarily that life begins at conception and not necessarily that life begins at birth, but instead that life begins at some point undetermined between conception and birth. To go again to movie references, the movie's a little old right now, but some of you might have seen the movie Juno. There's a scene in Juno where the title character is trying to decide whether she wants to go through with an abortion. So she goes to an abortion clinic, and one of her classmates is outside protesting, and the classmate says to her on her way in, your baby has fingernails. And Juno's sitting there in the clinic, and she decides, I can't go through with this. And she goes home, and she calls another friend on the phone, and she explains to her, I thought I was going to get an abortion. I'm not. And she looks, and she goes, fingernails. And that, for her, meant that this was life. But a lot of different systems are going to try to answer that question, and there isn't necessarily a definitive answer that works for everyone. Science and religion and philosophy are going to define that question differently. The problem with that is that when we leave the stasis of fact unresolved, what we then have is an unresolved question of definition. If a fetus, we can't know if a fetus begins at conception or at birth or somewhere in between, we have to ask ourselves, is a fetus a human being? And if it is a human being, a lot of people will jump to another stasis and will say that abortion constitutes murder. If you define the fetus as something that's not quite a human being, it's not yet viable outside the womb, then it might be not murder. And so a lot of people will have that argument based on the shaky question of fact. We then have, when we can't resolve those, lots of questions about causes and consequences. What effects does abortion have on the women who have them? There are some women who say that absolutely it was the right choice for me. I was 16, I wasn't yet ready to be a mother. This child would not have had a good life. There are other women who have had abortions who say things like, I regret that, and I wish I had given up the child for adoption, or I wish I had raised the child myself. So we have questions of causes and consequences because we can't answer the other two in ways that are definitive for everyone. We then get into a whole bunch of questions over whether abortion is ethical, whether allowing abortion, whether prohibiting abortion is ethical. Is it good or bad for individual women? Is it good or bad for society? Is it ethical as a society to allow women to have this if they're having it in mass numbers? From there, we often get to the question of policy, and the question of policy is, should the United States allow abortions, or perhaps should individual states like North Dakota or Minnesota or Iowa allow abortions, and if so, under what circumstances? There are lots of people who would say, we're not big fans of abortion, but maybe we make exceptions for cases of rape or incest, or when the mother's health is in danger. We often jump to the question of policy, but when we do, we often have unresolved questions earlier on. And that's my point here. That's the one takeaway I really want you to get out of stasis theory, is to slow down some of the arguments and see what happens when you focus on one argument at a time. Because next week when we add evidence and reasoning into the equation, you'll find that you'll have better evidence and reasoning. You'll also get better at undermining other people's evidence and reasoning when it's weak. And so I want you to recognize that the stases are often interconnected. What happens at one stasis often doesn't stay at that stasis, it moves to the other stases. I want you to recognize that. I want you to try and see if you can recognize this in other arguments that you might have. So not abortion, but maybe other political or cultural issues that you get involved in. See if you can figure out stasis theory. I know it's a little confusing the first week. It'll start to make a little bit more sense, and it'll make a little bit more sense why I'm teaching it to you in a public speaking class when we add in evidence and reasoning and you start working toward your persuasive speeches. So I'll leave it there, and I'll see you all next week.